Referendum question number 3 on the Rhode Island statewide election ballot next month is turning out to be quite a controversial one. Mark Murphy is the editor of the Providence Business News, and one of the stories in today's edition of the paper outlines the opinions of the proponents and opponents on whether a constitutional convention should be set up in Rhode Island in the months ahead. And it looks like, just from your article, the opponents, at least in terms of number of groups, seem to outnumber the proponents.
Yeah, and I think that fits in with how people are looking at this, which is a question of people who want to shake up the given order and people who want to retain the status quo to a large degree. And so those in favor of the status quo are probably, more legion, and so that's really where the battle is taking place, I think.
I think state law requires that that Rhode Island voters be asked once every 10 years whether they want a constitutional convention to be held. But in fact, there hasn't been a constitutional convention since 1986. That's the most recent one. And these are pictures from that convention. Lila Sappinsley, one of the convention delegates. What they did out of this convention, I believe, was they set up the Conflict of Interest Commission, which later became the Rhode Island Ethics Commission. That was one of the main results of this. We have footage coming up shortly, film footage from the late 1960s, where the conventioneers tried to set up a one-chamber legislature instead of the current two-chamber legislature, but that just didn't work. And that's really the story most of the time, isn't it? No major changes are recommended by the convention?
Well, it's kind of hard to get a consensus, right? I mean, if you have these polarized groups, we see how that works in Washington, so I can't imagine that's going to be much different in Rhode Island.
It's interesting. Some of the opponents, specifically the American Civil Liberties Union Rhode Island chapter, fear that these convention delegates will establish proposed changes to the Constitution that will impinge on people's civil rights. They say that happened in '86.
Yeah, and I think the ACLU has reason to say that it did happen. I mean, there was just a couple years ago, the Access to Public Records law was reinvigorated, but since then there's been a move by I think the Attorney General's office and by police departments to actually use the changes to clamp down on information accessible to the public. And so I think that in general there's a move for government, especially those in government bureaucracies, to try to shield themselves from openness, and I think in this case civil liberties goes right along with that.
There's more about the pros and cons about whether a constitutional convention should be held in Rhode Island in this week's edition of the Providence Business News, print copy and online. And Mark Murphy, we thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Frank.